They had no idea what they were doing when they turned on you. When they stabbed you in the back, they thought it was clever. They thought they'd get away with it, that their manipulation, their lies, their betrayal would go unnoticed or unpunished. They assumed you were too kind, too silent, too loyal to ever rise from the blow they delivered. But what they didn't realize is that betrayal cuts both ways. You see, when you betray someone who is loyal, someone who would have gone to war for you, someone who showed you their raw, vulnerable truth, you don't just injure them. You sever something in yourself. You fracture your own soul. And the deeper the betrayal, the louder the echoes of guilt become in the quiet moments. At first, they might have celebrated. Maybe they felt powerful. Maybe they believed they had won. But the thing about betraying a good person is this: you don't walk away whole. They ruined something sacred, and they underestimated the cost. Because while betrayal hurts the betrayed, it destroys the betrayer from the inside out. They assumed you were fragile, but you were indestructible. They assumed you were simple, but you were uncommon. They assumed you were substitutable, but now they're comprehending precisely how mistaken they existed, because individuals like you don't arrive frequently, and when they execute, they don't plead to remain. You never needed to elevate your voice to establish your position. Your quietness articulated more than any discourse ever could. Your remoteness articulated quantities. And your capacity to depart with elegance after all they executed was the final verification that you were never feeble. You were merely awaiting for the correct instant to cease expending your resilience on the mistaken individuals. They assumed they could depart without repercussion. They assumed they could deceive you, eliminate you, and advance with their existences as if nothing significant had occurred. As if you were merely another individual traversing through, as if what you provided was ordinary, substitutable, dismissible. But now, with duration exposing actuality and quietness magnifying vacancy, they're initiating to perceive what they genuinely forfeited. They didn't merely forfeit anyone. They forfeited someone irreplaceable. And that comprehension, that gradual infiltrating consciousness, is dissolving them from the interior outward. When someone deceives a beneficial individual, it doesn't merely conclude in that instant. At first, perhaps they experience liberated, empowered. They trust they've recovered dominance, extracted authority, or established some variety of audacious determination. But all of that isn't fantasy, a temporary comfort. Because eventually, when the residue resolves and the disturbance diminishes, and all the diversions they utilize to evade remorse commence to decline insufficient, they're abandoned with the actuality of what they surrendered. You were present when they were feeble. You positioned alongside them when they were uncertain of themselves, when nobody else perceived the value in them. You provided them faithfulness that didn't need to be acquired repeatedly. You presented a variety of emotional security that individuals investigate their complete existences for. That anchoring existence that articulates, I'm present. I trust in you. I won't surrender on you. And they didn't merely decline it. They obliterated it. Now they're existing with that forfeiture. And what consumes them isn't merely regret. It's the understanding that nobody else has ever perceived them that clearly or acknowledged them that unconditionally. And they understand they won't discover it again. Not because you were flawless, but because you were authentic. You weren't interested in executing manipulations. You appeared with your spirit accessible. You provided them honesty when it was troublesome. You provided them tolerance when they were unmeriting. You provided them the optimal of usage, and they accepted it for assumed. That's not an ordinary forfeiture. That's a spirit-level forfeiture. Because when you encounter someone who perceives you in your most adverse instance and still selects to remain, and then you deceive that individual, the burden of that determination doesn't abandon. It remains. It attaches itself to your essence. It becomes a phantom you can't escape. And the contradiction is, at the duration they assumed they were selecting something superior, something simpler, something more thrilling or more convenient or less requiring. But now nothing evaluates upward. Everything they contact experiences superficial. Every new bond experience is fragile. Because once you've experienced authenticity, everything fabricated experiences vacant. They'll attempt to reconstruct it naturally. They'll investigate for your characteristics in others. Perhaps they'll even pretend they've advanced. But profoundly, there's a quiet evaluation occurring in the background of their existence. A voice that murmurs, they're not like the one you abandoned. And it won't matter how many individuals they encounter, how many diversions they pursue, or how many new commencements they attempt to manufacture. The reality remains you were uncommon, and they forfeited you. You didn't merely present them cherishment. You presented them profundity, comprehension, steadiness. You established space for their disorder. You maintained their agony without evaluation. You were the one who trusted in them when they didn't trust in themselves, and they processed that like it was expendable. So now they're pursued not merely by what they executed, but by what they'll never possess again. And the profounder catastrophe? They didn't comprehend it until it was far excessively delayed. That's the value of treachery. It unveils its expense after the injury is executed, after the confidence has been demolished, after the connection has been incinerated. And once that comprehension establishes, it doesn't release. It becomes component of them. They recollect your expression of amusement, your expressions, the comfort of understanding someone possessed their support no matter what. And now they position in quietness, understanding they obliterated the precise thing they proclaim to appreciate. They comprehended that faithfulness like yours doesn't arrive with stipulations. And that's what rendered it influential. But they couldn't perceive it at the duration. Their pride, their immaturity, their limited perspective obscured their evaluation. And now they're compensating the value with every respiration of regret. You didn't possess to discipline them. Existence executed. Existence possesses a method of instructing merciless instructions. And the instruction they're acquiring now is one they'll transport perpetually. The instant they deceived you was the instant they segregated themselves from the one individual who perceived the optimal in them, even when they were at their most adverse. And no apology, no clarification, no modification of chronicle can alter that. You conversely transported the agony, but you also transported your honor. You departed not with retribution but with nobility, and that is something they will never dismiss. Not because they yearn what they possessed, but because they finally comprehend what they'll never retrieve. The bond, the security, the honesty, the persistent faithfulness. That variety of connection doesn't acquire substituted. It doesn't expand on vegetation. It's uncommon. And they discarded it. Now they're abandoned, investigating for reverberations of you in locations that will never evaluate upward. They're pursuing phantoms, anticipating to experience something adjacent to what they once possessed. But all they'll ever discover is the reminder. They released something hallowed. They obliterated something magnificent. And in executing so, they condemned themselves to an existence where your vacancy will be more deafening than any existence they attempt to occupy it with. They forfeited you, and now they're the ones abandoned with the emptiness. You could have disintegrated. Nobody would have accused you. What they executed was frigid, planned, and profoundly individual. They fractured confidence that required years to construct, demolished faithfulness you provided freely, and attempted to conceal your essence under the burden of their treachery. And temporarily, perhaps they assumed they achieved. Perhaps they even persuaded themselves that your quietness signified conquest, that your vacancy was capitulation. But what they didn't comprehend is that you weren't fracturing downward. You were fracturing liberated. You see, treachery executes something peculiar to an individual. It exposes the unprocessed reality of bonds, compels in confrontation with agony, and unveils what you're genuinely manufactured of. They assumed wounding you would abandon you immobilized, that you'd rotate, plead, disintegrate. But instead, it awakened something upward in you, a resilience they never troubled to comprehend. Because when someone deceives you, and you persist it with your spirit intact, you don't merely recover, you metamorphose. That's precisely what occurred. While they diverted themselves with falsehoods, pride, and rationalization, you were executing the profound, agonizing, silent labor of restoration. You were organizing through the devastation of everything they obliterated, not to restore what existed, but to reconstruct something superior. Not a version of yourself frantic for their approval, but a version of yourself anchored in reality, nobility, and focus. And that expedition, that quiet internal reconstructing, is where everything commenced to transition. Because the instant you ceased attempting to comprehend why they executed what they executed, and instead initiated requesting who you were proceeding to become because of it, you extracted your authority returned. They miscalculated you, not because they assumed you were feeble, but because they needed to assume you were feeble in sequence to rationalize their behaviors. It's simpler to deceive someone when you dehumanize them. When you persuade yourself they were excessive, excessively emotional, excessively pardoning, excessively anything, But the reality is they couldn't manage your resilience, and so they attempted to obliterate it. And when that didn't operate, they attempted to persuade themselves it never existed. But now they perceive it. Now they experience it because you elevated quietly, persistently. You elevated with each movement away from their toxicity. You elevated every occasion you selected tranquility across disorder, expansion across resentment, reality across comfort. You didn't possess to demonstrate anything. Your existence initiated executing that for you. You became a reflection for their embarrassment, not by assaulting them, but simply by existing in your authority. Unapologetic, steady, and complete. And that's what pursues them now. They're observing you prosper, observing you advance without them, observing you radiate in manners you never executed while they were around. And it pierces because you're no longer the version of yourself they once possessed authority across. You're not awaiting for termination. You're not investigating vengeance. You've surpassed the entire narrative they attempted to maintain you confined in. While they disintegrate under the burden of remorse, regret, and unresolved repercussions, you've transformed. You're no longer a casualty of what they executed. You've become the designer of your restoration. And that's what authentic authority resembles. They forfeited dominance the instant you comprehended you never needed them to establish your value. That you could depart from treachery and still construct a magnificent, resilient, authentic existence. That's the instant everything altered because now they're the ones confined not in your existence, but in your vacancy. You ascending was never about vengeance. It was about recovering yourself. It was about selecting not to allow their treachery be the final expression in your narrative. And now that you've executed the labor, now that you've emerged more resilient, they experience it. They experience the forfeiture of you, not merely as an individual but as a possibility. You were the one who would have remained, the one who would have battled for them, the one who would have traversed through flames to perceive them achieve. And they discarded that. Now they position with the reverberation of what they forfeited while you traverse forward, transporting the resilience of everything you persisted. You didn't need to wound them returned. Existence already is, because what could be more agonizing than observing someone you deceived prosper without you? What could be more catastrophic than comprehending that your existence wasn't necessary for their expansion, and in reality your vacancy became the precise reason they expanded? They disintegrate because they understand they possessed someone authentic, someone irreplaceable, and they selected to discard it. You elevate not because you're emotionless, but because you selected not to remain fractured. Because you perceive the treachery not as the conclusion, but as the commencement of a profounder, more intelligent, more persistent version of yourself. You transformed the agony into authority, the quietness into lucidity, the decline into redirection. And now your existence, your tranquility, your steadiness, your assurance is a existing reminder of what they forfeited. And that comprehension is far more substantial than any discipline you could have transmitted. You didn't merely persist their treachery, you exceeded it. You rendered it insignificant. You rendered them insignificant. And that is the supreme vindication.